Hello, and welcome to our module on exceptionality in schools. In this module, we will focus on kind of two dominant learning outcomes, but also explore some different aspects of what exceptionality means. We'll focus on sharing a common understanding and exploration of what an exceptional student is and how it's defined. And then we'll talk a little bit about the significance of the Individuals with Disability Act, also known as IDEA. We'll take these two kind of primary outcomes and move towards a better understanding of disability justice and disability allyship. So as we move into this module, I want you all to, again, come with a shared understanding of terms and definitions in regards to exceptionality. For many of you, this might be a very new term, something that you've never heard before. And for others, it might be something that you're very familiar with because you find yourself in educational spaces where you've heard this term used before. But the term in the context of this course and how we will be using it as we learn about and move through this new module is to think about exceptional children as an inclusive term that refers to children that have either learning or behavior challenges, have some form of physical disability or sensory impairment, and also children who are considered to be intellectually gifted or have some type of special talent. So at the core of thinking about exceptionality is the idea that we're thinking about exceptional people being individuals that require some form of individualized program, whether it's regards to special education services or other related services in order to truly benefit from their learning in the educational space. This use of exceptionality in school spaces is often times at the forefront of categorization with school-age children and how we come to understand that the ways that we explore exceptionality is oftentimes to some form of referral process or testing process to determine eligibility. So what does that mean and why is that important? Well, there are a significant segment of our population in the US that is made up of exceptional individuals. Even as I'm speaking, you might even be thinking back maybe to your own individual experiences or experiences of those, some loved ones or experiences in the different schools that some of you are actually in the classrooms currently as you're taking these courses. And so the data suggests that there are a huge population of individuals that are defined as exceptional individuals. In the CDC reports from 2010, when this, as we pulled the latest data, this number might be actually increased just a little, that the Census Bureau accounted for about 54 million individuals in the US that were said to have some type of disability or some type of special learning program or plan. And that's accounting for individuals that have reported, right? So thinking about being either tested or referred on the previous slide. And so that's why I suggest this number is probably substantially higher because there are those mechanisms in place that account for the numbers that we have when it comes to how it's reported to the Census Bureau. We also know that in regards to thinking about research and student experience, there have been tons of researchers and projects and initiatives that have explored exceptional identities and how we can make sense of supporting students in schools. And so in a report from Hallahan, Kaufman, and Pullen, they suggested that there were approximately 10% of students, again, thinking about how students are referred and or tested for eligibility, that receive some type of special education services in their school space. So that's about over 6 million if you accounted for how that percentage equated to population of students in schools. So it's important to think about and know what exceptionality is because there's such a huge segment of our population that utilizes the services and it's defined in this way in school spaces. And so that takes us to this next kind of unpacking around thinking about the ways in which individuals embrace and embody this categorization that's connected to exceptionality. So as I suggested in the previous slides, we know that their eligibility for special programs in the learning environment oftentimes is connected to some form of referral or testing process. And in that referral and testing process, establishes a labeling system or structure that emerges in connection to those students. So if you're thinking about it in the context of the continuum of understanding of exceptional identities, we know that both aspects of students with special education needs in regards to students that might be identified as twice exceptional or that have gifted educational needs, they exist on a continuum and thus have to have certain learning programs in the school spaces and also carry the label of what it means to exist in those exceptional identities. There are often many ways that we see labels show up, and we'll talk about labels even more in this module as we're thinking about student experience and what it means for students that exist within the continuum of children with disabilities and or children that are considered to be gifted and talented, with the idea that there's also components of being twice exceptional. So existing at the intersection of being gifted and talented and also existing in the space of needing special education services. We'll start a little bit with unpacking students with disabilities or children with disabilities in special education more directly. So we know that when we're talking about students with disabilities, oftentimes the labels associated with those components of identity are said to be connected to students that have intellectual disabilities or ID, learning disabilities. Oftentimes individuals kind of interchange those two and they are defined differently. Having speech impairments or challenges, hearing impairments, emotional disturbances, so that's connected to like a behavioral disorder, having any physical or health impairments. So those are the primary ways that we attend to thinking about students that are with disabilities that are labeled in such a way in school spaces. With these labels, of how we categorize students and children with disabilities, there are many critics around how we make sense of those labels and what that means in the student experiences. Those that are critics and that oppose the characterization of labeling students, specifically as we're attending to children with disabilities, is connected to the practice of how oftentimes these labels have demeaning and stigmatizing realities for people with disabilities. Stigmatizing and demeaning labels that oftentimes follow them through adulthood, right? And so thinking about the ways in which they exist within their educational spaces then translates to how people engage with them in social, societal spaces as well. And oftentimes, as we've seen in scholarship and research, um, leads to being denied opportunities, leads to being excluded from certain opportunities and practices, leads to different types of engagement with peers, etc. And so the context and understanding of labeling thus continues to kind of be at the forefront as we think about the lived realities of students with disabilities and exceptional identities. So what does that mean and how do we think about that a little bit further? Well, we know that the school setting often intensifies any cognitive or academic deficits that students navigate, right? Oftentimes, because as individuals that exist in their exceptional identities exist within their neighborhoods and their homes, they're navigating a more inclusive, warm, kind environment. And it's oftentimes when they leave those spaces, right? When they leave those spaces and have to exist in community spaces and oftentimes in educational spaces, they move into spaces where the labels are more deficit and are more stigmatizing, thus having implications on how that individual then experiences their schooling realities. And so oftentimes, because of lack of knowledge, because of socially constructed components of understanding around understanding individuals with exceptional identities, there are negative connotations and stigmas that are pushed more in educational spaces than ever the student would experience it in their neighborhood and home life. And thus, what's been found in the research has had implications on how students with exceptional identities experience their schooling realities, how in the general education classroom, how there are negative attitudes towards their peers. So there's some components of socialization that are socializing that's disrupted in the presence of these labels, in regards to students with disabilities. And so they're socially rejected or neglected in some sense because of the ways in which individuals have made sense of the labels associated with their exceptional identity. This is something that has continued to be researched over time and has some historical kind of undertones, that you can very easily kind of look into as we come to understand more aspects of thinking about exceptional identities. Oftentimes, at the core of that labeling and that stigma and the ways in which that um, negative labeling persists in school spaces, we know that there's connections to insensitivity, to prejudice, to apathy, um, oftentimes not only from peers, but also sometimes from administrators, right? Those that might be responsible for implementing certain types of programs and initiatives in schools for individuals with disabilities. And oftentimes that then trickles into the way that we see policies take place, the way that we see the upholding of laws, right? So what you'll learn as we move through this module is that there are laws in place to support and protect students with exceptional identities, but oftentimes because of the ways individuals make sense of labels, enacting and responsibly implementing and upholding those laws is something that might not take place in the proper way because of the ways in which individuals make sense of those labels. We also know that when we're thinking about labels, that there are different ways that they come into play, right? And so some disabilities in regards to thinking about the needs of students are seen to be more socially acceptable than others. And there are components of understanding disabilities at intersections of identity, which show up and mean very different things for different people, depending on where they land on their intersection of identity. And we'll talk about that and be able to watch a short clip on what that means as we move forward. We know that learning disabilities, which is a newer category of exceptionality, is seen to be more socially acceptable in regards to thinking about disability conditions and supports. More students are more apt to want to share that aspect of need because it seems to not carry the same type of stigma that you might see associated with some of the other aspects of identity in regards to children with disabilities. For instance, when we attend to intellectual disability, oftentimes there's a want to be disconnected from being labeled in that way. And as you attend to how you see it in the research and the scholarship, intellectual disabilities are oftentimes more identified with being from a lower SES group. So oftentimes there's a disconnect from wanting to be tied to intellectual disabilities because of that intersection of self, right, in regards to class identity. And then when you attend to how individuals make sense of learning disability, typically you see a presence of identity and embracement of that identity in the context of thinking about middle class backgrounds and even upper class, higher SES statuses, right? And so that's what I'm attending to when I'm suggesting that how individuals navigate exceptionality in the intersection of other parts of self has very clear direction for how we can make sense of labeling and what it means for schooling experience. So now we'll switch gears just a bit and think about that other end of the other aspect of exceptional identity that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And that's connected to often what we don't often hear talked about much, which is thinking about gifted and talented students. These are students that are also referred and or tested into a specialized learning program in their schooling spaces. So they are still considered to be exceptional individuals. And as I suggested very briefly earlier, and you'll get a little bit of an introduction to Temple Grandin in this module, who's considered to be twice exceptional. There are individuals that fare as being gifted and talented, many individuals that fare as being gifted and talented, identified in this way, and then also having and needing specialized programs in regards to having a disability. It could be a behavioral challenge or tension for the student. It could be a plethora of things, but they exist at the intersection of both of these components of exceptional identity. And in this regard, oftentimes students have less engaged with critically how we make sense of gifted and talented students, oftentimes when we think about exceptional narratives. So if we think about diving into what is known to be connected to gifted and talented students. We know that there are as many as 3 million academically gifted students in the United States. And this data point, again, as I suggested in Making Sense of Students with Disabilities, is what is reported and accounted for in Census Bureau data and schooling and district data, right? We know that students that are considered to be gifted and talented are also considered to benefit from special education programming. So some specialized program that is different from the typical educational offering that exists within their educational space. There hasn't been much legislation and case law connected to the advancement and support for gifted and talented students, oftentimes because of the assumptions that these students have what they need. And so there have been critics also in regards to thinking about what needs to be in place for gifted and talented students. And the only kind of solid case law that's out there at the moment is the Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act that passed in the 1980s. That was actually a federal program that was dedicated specifically to gifted and talented students. And since then, we haven't seen much federal supports and programs for gifted and talented programs. So when you're attending to funding and how we make sense of what that means for gifted and talented students, oftentimes those types of programs are funded at the state level. And so as you move through understandings of school funding, those can vary from district to district and school to school, right? In regards to what types of programs are available for students in their respective schools. The Javits Gifted and Talented Students Education Act, as I suggested, that passed in the late 1980s, was an attempt to try to centralize the fact that schools were not equitably funding programs for gifted and talented students because of the differentiation that we see in regards to funding at the state and local levels, right? And so there was a push from families and communities that there needed to be some type of federal support for students that identified as gifted and talented, because if the schools didn't have funding, then those programs didn't exist for those children. And so also the act was supposed to also undergird some scientifically based research that would give innovative strategies and projects that schools could adopt or embody to think about how they thought about meeting the educational needs of their students that identified in this way. And so it was an overarching kind of umbrella program that sought to not necessarily fund the gifted programs, but to create innovative strategies to think about how we engage. And so because of that innovation of strategy, there was more modes of community support and funding opportunities that would matriculate to those schools. As of 2011, and actually I think as I checked it more recently, there were proposals to eliminate funding entirely for these initiatives that would enhance the types of funding supports that could come from other spaces to support the local gifted programs. Again, connected to the idea that I suggested earlier, that when we think about exceptional identities, that children with disabilities are seen to need the special program, whereas gifted and talented students can actually fend for themselves and don't need additional funding to get specialized learning programs and supports from their respective schools. And so there's critics on both sides of where individuals fare, but it's very important to note that as we're coming to exploring exceptional identities, that this is also an aspect of thinking about what we are talking about when we're attending to individuals that are identified in this way. And also because labeling exists in gifted education as well. Oftentimes when I get to this point in the semester and I have students kind of critically self-reflect on their own experiences, many students talk about either being a part of a gifted or advanced program in their K-12 educational histories or not, and what that meant and the types of labels that they navigated, right? So there's an assumption, the assumption on the previous slide is that gifted and talented students that are identified as gifted in school spaces can fend for themselves. But oftentimes, there's still some aspect of social rejection that's connected to the ways in which they are labeled as such. So very similarly, as we're attending to some components of labeling and stigmatization in the experiences of children with disabilities, we also know that there's some discrimination and social rejection, although in a different way, that is present for students with gifted, that are labeled as gifted or talented. And it oftentimes exists at intersections of identity. So yet, like individuals with disability, there's some components of mainstream suffering in regards to students with disabilities and what labeling means as they transition into adulthood. There are still some feelings of exclusion for students that are identified as being gifted or not in their respective K-12 experiences. Speaking more concretely to a personal lived experience, as you attend to individuals that might identify with an oppressed identity or minoritized identity in connection to their ethnicity, and then be connected to aspects of exceptionality in regards to their connection to a gifted and talented program. Oftentimes there's research around it being a negative thing or a bad thing to be associated with a gifted and talented program. And I know for some, even hearing me say that, it might sound very far-fetched, but it's a very real narrative for many students, oftentimes because for students that might come from a lower SES, because oftentimes as you attend to gifted and talented programs, they tend to have larger percentages of students from higher SES backgrounds. And so if you are in the program and your class identity is different from everybody that's in the program, or your racial or ethnic identity is different from everybody that's in the program, what does that mean for the ways in which you connect to the label that is gifted education? And so that's another aspect of understanding that's important to think about as we understand exceptional identities. And understanding those components of experience in regards to labeling, in regards to students with disabilities, and also students identified as gifted and talented, brings us into exploring more how we can see efforts for case law and litigation that has been at the forefront for trying to think more openly around practices and policies that can support these students. As I suggested on the previous slide, there hasn't been much litigation and case law connected to the experiences of gifted and talented students, but there has been quite a bit of litigation and case law connected to the experiences of children with disabilities. Specifically thinking and knowing, as we have explored other histories in regards to case law and litigation for other components of identity, that this has been a struggle and an effort for educational rights for individuals with disability that has been very hard, and is still a very hard and heavy reality, even present day. Many of the court decisions that we see that are connected to the advancements of litigation and case law in regards to children with disabilities is connected to a lot of the civil rights cases that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. Oftentimes in the advancements of what we've known to be connected to the rights of other oppressed groups has also been at the core and framed the foundation for how advocates have then went forth to advocate for inclusion in the experiences of children with disabilities. Oftentimes when you're thinking about litigation and case law, attorneys advocate for children with disabilities alongside some actual examples from parents, as we've seen in other areas of experience and other facets of identity. And it's been those lived experiences, those voices that have brought to the forefront what is actually happening in these schools and in the classroom that has been what has disrupted and advanced a lot of supports for children with disabilities. So as I suggested at the beginning, as we attend to litigation and case law, one of the nation's most advanced and really how you see litigation and inclusion and practice in schools present day is the Individuals with Disabilities Act, also known as IDEA. This is the nation's special education law that is used across the country that gives directives and guidance for how schools should be supporting students with disabilities, how schools evaluate and support families at no cost to families. And so oftentimes where you see IDEA enacted is in some form of diagnosis, oftentimes that parents bring into spaces, but also it's in partnership often with a representative from the school that can help kind of guide supports that parents might need that they might not be aware of. What's important to note is that oftentimes having a diagnosis doesn't always guarantee that a child will qualify for IDEA. And so there's some very kind of nuanced understandings of IDEA and how it functions. And so we'll watch very briefly this overview of the Individuals with Disabilities Act to get a better understanding of how we see it playing out in school spaces.
Have you ever had the experience of being the only person in a classroom who had trouble doing something or understanding a certain concept? How would you feel if every day in school you faced the same kind of difficulty while everyone else seemed to find the work easier than you? What kind of support and teaching would you need to keep trying? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a law that was passed to help and support students who face this situation every day. The current version of the law was passed in 2004, but it's based on a law that was first created in 1975, known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It revolutionized the education of children with disabilities, which, in 2001, was more than 6 million children. The IDEA requires that public schools provide specialized services to all children with disabilities from birth to age 21 for the purpose of granting equal access to education. A specific part of the law mandates public schools to create an individualized education program, or IEP, for each student who is found to have an eligible disability. An IEP is a document that is drawn up and agreed upon by teachers, parents, specialists, and, if possible, the student. The document describes the present achievement level of the student, then specifies goals for the school year, as well as any special support needed to achieve those goals. In other lessons, we'll discuss learning disabilities in more depth and how to use an IEP in the classroom. The focus of this lesson is the law itself. Let's visit Cornerstone Elementary to see an example of the IDEA in action. Meet Susie. Susie is a bright, energetic third grader who loves school. Susie has a hearing impairment. She's not deaf, but her hearing is poor enough that it affects her educational performance, as she has trouble hearing any of her teachers. Susie would qualify for special assistance under the IDEA. Her IEP would include information about her hearing impairment, such as the most recent hearing test results, and would also outline multiple goals and services agreed upon by her parents and teachers. Although Susie might meet with a specialist once or twice a week, most of her time would still be spent in the classroom with all of her fellow students. This is because another aspect of the IDEA is the requirement that a student with a disability be educated in the least restrictive environment possible, or LRE. In other words, a student like Susie who has a disability should have the opportunity to be educated with her non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. Susie should have the opportunity to interact with her peers and have the same access to educational experiences as everyone else. Susie may just need additional resources, such as visual aids, to optimize her learning. Individualized education programs and least restrictive environment are the two most well-known principles of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. However, there are four.
So that's just a very quick overview to give us some nice understanding. And I encourage you, if as you watch this, if it was something that you would like to explore further, as you can see, there are many different TED Talks and resources out there that can give you more insights into IDEA. And now I want us to take some time to pause and reflect. And I do this intentionally because at this point we have gotten through some shared understandings of the terminology, some understandings of labeling and categorizing and how that is connected to the experiences of exceptional identities. And what I suggested in previous slide, and actually how you kind of explore a little in this module, is what it means to exist at the intersection of particular identities, specifically as we're attending to, before we move forward, conversations around disability justice and disability allyship. And so I wanted to take some time to pause and reflect and have you see an example of what I am attending to when I'm talking about intersections of identity and how that plays itself out very differently depending on who you are. So take a minute to listen and just pause and reflect as we listen in on Kay Barrett's lived experience.
Kate Lundy Barrett, activist, cultural worker, and disability justice advocate. Race and disability, race and gender, race and class. I can't go to a store or a doctor's office or a date and not be seen as brown, trans with a cane. There's no way. And I'm not going to choose any of those things. I do not want to minimize or dictate how people live and experience and identify. Intersectionality is really super critical to me. I'm not just attacked because I'm trans. I'm attacked because I'm brown and I'm disabled. People are being imprisoned, criminalized, harmed, not given jobs, not given medical support. They're not adequately being loved. It's critical that we get those resources, and it's critical that we get those resources from that community. Every day I'll be on a train and someone will, try to get a seat at the, disability access seating. And depending on that person, depending on how they see me and my masculinity, right? Brown masculinity is not supposed to be vulnerable. Gender nonconformity, are you a boy or a girl? And then I'm young, so you're not really disabled. So all of these things are coming into play on a frequent basis. And it happens when I'm at the medical office, when I'm with the doctor, how many times I'm misgendered. So if they see my brownness, we just want to talk about your brownness. When I'm in white queer spaces, like, let's just talk about you being transgender or queer. When I'm in very able-bodied, fit, radical people of color spaces, they don't really want to discuss access or the needs of my community being disabled. Real talk, white people are treated very different in the trans community than brown people, than black people, than Latino people. Real talk, people with disabilities, oftentimes it's a lot of white people, cis-sexual, rich people who can afford healthcare, and that is not my community. For me, what's super pivotal is to acknowledge that race doesn't just move everything along, but that it interprets and informs all the other parts of me. It's because somebody is brown and trans. It is because somebody is physically disabled or perceived as crazy, right? And brown and black. And those things inform each other. When somebody says, oh, that trans person of color is so lazy, they don't know how to get a job. Well, A, that's ableism. They think that they can't work. B, sexism, and C, anti-blackness or racism, right? So all of those things are tools or weapons happening simultaneously on me, on you. I think it's really critical that we engage in dialogue that might make us uncomfortable. If we don't address that depth, our level of depth, and also the level of depth to which we are being harmed and limited, I don't think we're going to be able to really do groundbreaking work or innovative work to address our needs. And in order to do so, we have to not just see race in a vacuum.
So as you watch that, I hope that you were able to possibly learn some terms that you hadn't heard before, but also specifically to attend to what Kay was suggesting around intersections of identity, particularly as we're attending to disability justice and disability allyship in this module and what that means for student experience. The Race and series that is sponsored by the Center for Racial Justice Innovation has some very great resources. Again, if you would like to go in and kind of take a gander at some other um, talks around intersections of identity and what that means for lived experience. So as we move forward in the last few slides of this presentation is to unpack what we got a little bit of as we met Kay in the previous slide, and that is the disability justice model. And so oftentimes when I talk about exceptional identities with students, I often do have a few students here and there that they know that this is a passion area for them, right? They know they want to either serve in regards to advancing their education and special education training. You're already kind of working in those roles professionally, and you see yourself potentially as connected to being a disability, being a part of the disability justice framework and or disability allyship model. And so what I wanted to do as we move to ending this and you make your way through the remainder of the module materials is to offer some shared understanding about what those terms mean and what is said to be really at the forefront if this is something, if it's new to you, that you might want to take up. So we know that disability, specifically when we're talking about disability in connection to exceptional identities, it can be understood in the context of being a multi-issue, right? A multi-issue and something that is a part of a multi-movement commitment to social justice, right? So what we got in the previous slide and even what I've talked about in earlier slides are what it means to think about intersections of identity in the aspects of thinking about how individuals navigate this component of themselves. And so when we're attending to the disability justice model, we're talking about a model that thinks and seeks to address oppressive culture that would interrogate systemic and structural iniquities that are existing around it, right? So not just talking about or thinking or framing our ideological thought on fixing people with disabilities, but rather in addressing and disrupting and interrogating some of the systemic ways that we know that their challenges exist, right? We talked about labeling. We talked about categorizing in schools and what that means. We talked about the stigma that is associated. We talked about in the previous slides what it means to exist connected to a particular form of exceptional identity in its intersection with class identity and who has access in the previous talk with Kay around resources with healthcare and programs, right? So thinking about those systemic, those larger things that are connected to how individuals with disabilities navigate their lived realities. The disability justice model also posits that disability is a political experience of oppression, right? So it really is heightened in the understanding of the social identities that make up that experience for those individuals. So attending to an individual's disability in the disability justice model is also attending to other aspects of who they are and how they show up to truly interact and understand what they are navigating, right? So the disability justice model requires a power analysis. And at this point, as we're listening to this talk, we should have a better understanding of power and oppression and what that means, right? So thinking about the power systems and structures that are at play that could shape the interaction of different aspects of social identity. And so the model, or somebody that takes up the disability justice model, understands these three components are at the core of thinking about being committed to um, disability justice. And in that commitment to disability justice, then we can move towards understanding disability allyship. And oftentimes there are not as clear understandings of what is meant by disability justice, and thus a very disconnected and fragmented understanding of what true disability allyship is. And so when we're talking about disability allyship, now that we now have a better understanding of what disability justice means in disrupting and systemic and structural realities and really requiring a power analysis, allies actively work to embody and embrace and move towards disability justice. Allies engage in constantly unlearning some of the cultural and societal beliefs that are rooted in ableism, right? That devalue the experiences of disabled people. And I like to emphasize when I get to this point, unlearning, right? The component of unlearning. And unlearning can exist across all of these other aspects of identity, right? Because we have been socialized in our spaces to unconsciously and maybe even consciously em- embody and embrace ideas that perpetuate the oppressive narratives of individuals that we've talked about in this course, right? And so you have to be a part of knowing that you have to unlearn some things, right? Both culturally and societally, to really get at the root of what's happening for people in their intersectional identities. Allies value the embodied knowledge of oppressed groups, right? So allies would be very open to and live in a space that seeks to center the voices of those that are living at those intersections of identity. By being able to listen to the needs of those that navigate oppressed identities, a true ally can work in partnership with that respective community, and in this, for the sake of this module, with the leaders of the disability community, to amplify solutions for access and inclusion, right? So, not recreating, not standing alone, but partnering alongside the community to amplify the solutions is at the core of thinking about disability allyship. So, disability allies are committed to being co conspirators, right? Working alongside and joining in efforts to fight against disability injustice. And that is at the forefront of thinking about these two very salient points that are so important as we're thinking about exceptional identities and student experience in and outside of school spaces. Um, this is something that I'm hoping as you're listening that will prompt you to read more critically the readings in the module, or if you've already read them, to think about them more critically. To think about your own experiences around how you've navigated these components of identity. Oftentimes, again, in that critical self-reflection, might we better understand and make sense of maybe what happened to us or what happened to those around us. And so I wanted to take some time, and if you haven't already been introduced to Dr. Temple Grandin, I wanted to introduce you at this point. Many times, many students are familiar with Dr. Temple Grandin. But Temple Grandin would be defined as, in present day, someone that would be considered to be twice exceptional. And there is a biopic on, not sure what platform it is on, you probably can do a nice Google search to find it, that explores the life of Dr. Temple Grandin. And you'll do a little bit of engagement with Dr. Grandin in some assignments and some course discussion. But it's an amazing film, so if you have the opportunity to do so, feel free to go and watch the film in its entirety. But I like to show a clip from this film because it really centralizes this notion around how we can think about and question how society can move towards changing the way that we label people that have minds that are different, or that have a reality or exist in a body that is different, right? And how we can push back on the notion of whether or not labels are truly necessary in the experiences, particularly in this module of in the narratives of exceptional students. And so I'm going to play this clip. And again, it's almost like another pause and reflect moment. So just think about what you're hearing, and then we will wrap up.
I want to hear from any more experts.
If you will just let me finish. Will you please let me finish? With intensive psychotherapy, an autistic child can be treated.
The report plainly shows that autism is not a psychological problem.
I am not familiar with the Grandin report.
Calm down, sweetie. Sweetie, calm down.
It would be better if you could get her to sit calmly. They're trying to control her.
We were told self-stimming is good. It eventually calms her.
Self-stimming is self-comforting.
Rocking, spinning, rolling on the floor, flapping.
I think spinning is good. And rolling, too. Self-stimulation does seem to eventually calm the nervous system. It can be a way to compensate for not being held. And being held by another person is scary, but rolling or being held by surfaces produces the calming effect that ordinary children get from a hug.
How old's your child?
Well, I don't have children. No, I'm autistic. And I need the sensation of being hugged. And I've developed a machine that I get into and hugs me, and I'm different afterwards. I'm more social. Well, I didn't speak until I was 4. Now I have a BA and a master's, and I'm studying for my doctorate.
Please don't shout. Please don't shout.
Most autistic people are very sensitive to sounds and colors. Overstimulation hurts. You know, people talking too much at once, you can cause us to panic.
How did you get cured?
Well, I'm not cured. I'll always be autistic. My mother refused to believe that I wouldn't speak. And when I learned to speak, she made me go to school. And in school and at home, manners and rules were really important. They were pounded into me. I was lucky. All these things worked for me. Everyone worked hard to make sure that I was engaged. And they knew I was different, but not less. And I had a gift. I could see the world in a new way. I could see details that other people were blind to. My mother pushed me to become self-sufficient. I worked summers at my aunt's ranch. I went to boarding school and college. Those things were uncomfortable for me at first, but they helped me to open doors to new worlds.
Excuse me, please, but we want to hear everything.
Are you a scientist?
You cannot hit people.
Think you can figure it out?
Do you look nice?
A pen and a clipboard.
Think of it as a door. Just take one knock to the head.
I don't understand why people are cruel for no
You have
reason.
a very special mind. You see the world in ways that others can't.
Miss Grandin, this is a masterpiece.
The door opened and I went through it.
Yes, he did. And I held it.
I'm Temple Grandin.
Temple Grandin is currently a professor at Colorado State University, has been a professor there for over 25 years. She is a trailblazer known for her work for people with autism. So thinking about amplifying the voices of people that are living those lived realities. Temple Grandin brought voice to individuals living with autism, the very first person to self-narrate and share lived experience in connection to autism. Very, very powerful film. And there's some components in this film that can also, we can critically think about too, right? Like who might be missing, who has the opportunity to voice. But at bare minimum, it at least gives us a nice kind of starting point for thinking about implications of labels and implications for moving in a direction towards thinking about intersections of identity, thinking about lived experience, thinking about voice, and thinking about truly embodying disability justice. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact your instructor for your course, and have a good one.